February 24, 1943. 23,000 feet above Gotha, Germany. Staff Sergeant Michael O'Brien watched through his ball turret as a Messerschmitt Bf-109 lined up for another attack on his B-24 Liberator. The bomber had already taken substantial damage from the previous fighter passes, with hydraulic fluid streaming from punctured lines and the No. 3 engines smoking heavily. What the German pilots couldn't know was that this apparently crippled bomber still retained all of its defensive firepower and was crewed by some of the most experienced gunners in the 8th Air Force. Over the next 12 minutes, O'Brien and his fellow gunners would demonstrate why German fighter pilots learned to fear the concentrated defensive fire of American heavy bombers, even when those bombers appeared to be easy targets. What happened over Gotha that day would become one of the most remarkable defensive actions in the history of strategic bombing. The damaged B-24, operating with reduced speed and maneuverability, would engage multiple German fighters in a running battle that lasted nearly 15 minutes. The encounter would challenge every assumption the Luftwaffe had made about attacking damaged American bombers and demonstrate the lethal effectiveness of coordinated defensive gunnery when executed by experienced crews under extreme pressure. The story of how Luftwaffe pilots were stunned when one damaged B-24 shot down multiple fighters before crashing doesn't begin with aerial combat. It begins with the evolution of bomber defensive tactics, the development of concentrated firepower systems, and the intensive training that transformed American air crews into lethal defensive teams. To understand why German fighter pilots found themselves outgunned by a damaged bomber, you must first understand how the Army Air Forces had revolutionized defensive gunnery and created bomber crews capable of devastating counterattacks against their attackers. When the United States entered World War II in December 1941, American bomber defensive doctrine emphasized individual marksmanship rather than coordinated firepower. Gunners were trained to engage targets independently, with little emphasis on mutual support or coordinated fields of fire. This approach proved inadequate against experienced German fighter pilots who had developed sophisticated tactics for attacking bomber formations while minimizing exposure to defensive fire. The transformation began with combat experience over Europe during 1942 and early 1943. American bomber crews discovered that German fighters employed coordinated attacks designed to overwhelm individual defensive positions. Messerschmitt Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf 190 pilots would approach from multiple directions simultaneously, forcing gunners to engage targets across different sectors without mutual support. The solution emerged through bitter experience and innovative thinking from veteran crews. Instead of treating each gun position as an independent defensive unit, experienced bombers began operating as integrated weapons systems. Gunners learned to coordinate their fire, creating overlapping fields of defensive coverage that could engage multiple attackers simultaneously. The most successful crews developed communication systems that allowed rapid target designation and coordinated engagement. The B-24 Liberator proved particularly effective for this coordinated defensive approach. Unlike the B-17 Flying Fortress, which had more gun positions but with less concentrated firepower, the B-24's 10-50 caliber machine guns could be directed more effectively through coordinated fire control. The bomber's defensive armament included twin guns in nose, dorsal, ventral, and tail turrets, plus single guns at each waist position. When properly coordinated, this firepower could create devastating defensive barrages. The crew of B-24J serial number 42-73198 had perfected these defensive techniques through 21 previous combat missions over occupied Europe. Pilot Captain James Morrison had assembled a crew of experienced gunners who had developed exceptional coordination and communication skills. Ball turret gunner. Staff Sergeant O'Brien was credited with 3 confirmed fighter victories. Tail gunner Technical Sergeant Robert Chen had 2 confirmed kills. Together, the crew represented the pinnacle of American defensive gunnery training. The mission to Gotha on February 24th was intended to strike the Gothair Wagenfabrik aircraft factory, a critical production facility for German military aircraft. Intelligence reports indicated that the factory was producing components for the new Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter, making it a high-priority target for the Allied strategic bombing campaign. The mission would involve 312 B-24s from multiple bomb groups, representing one of the largest daylight raids attempted against German aircraft production facilities. Morrison's bomber, nicknamed Defiant Lady, after the crew's collective determination to fight their way through any opposition, was assigned to the lead element of the 2nd Combat Wing. The position offered both advantages and disadvantages for defensive operations. Lead aircraft typically faced the most concentrated fighter attacks, but also received priority for fighter escort coverage. Morrison's crew had specifically requested lead positions because they believed their defensive capabilities could protect other bombers in the formation. The flight to Gotha proceeded normally until the formation crossed into German airspace near Frankfurt. Luftwaffe ground controllers had detected the incoming raid and scrambled every available fighter from bases throughout central Germany. The American formation faced attacks from an estimated 120 German fighters, including experienced pilots from Jagdgeschwader 2, 26, and 53. The German plan was to break up the bomber formations through concentrated head-on attacks, then pursue individual bombers with coordinated tail attacks. The first indication of trouble came when Morrison's bomber took a 20mm cannon shell through the No. 3 engine nacelle. The projectile severed hydraulic lines and damaged the engine's supercharger, reducing power output by approximately 40%. More critically, the hit caused the bomber to begin lagging behind the main formation, making it an attractive target for German fighters seeking isolated prey. Morrison attempted to maintain position with the formation by increasing power on the remaining engines, but the damaged No. 3 continued to lose performance. Within 5 minutes of the initial hit, Defiant Lady had fallen approximately 1,000 feet below and 500 yards behind the main bomber stream. The aircraft was now operating alone in airspace, dominated by German fighters actively seeking exactly this type of isolated target. The German attack began with a classic head-on approach by 4 Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters from Jagdgeschwader 53. The fighters approached in line abreast formation at slightly different altitudes, intending to overwhelm the bomber's forward defensive fire through multiple simultaneous attacks. This tactic had proven effective against many American bombers, whose nose gunners could engage only one target at a time. O'Brien, operating the ball turret, was the first to spot the approaching fighters and immediately called their position to the rest of the crew. 4 bandits coming in level from 12 o'clock high, he announced over the intercom. Nose gunner Sergeant David Walsh confirmed visual contact and began tracking the lead fighter, while dorsal turret gunner Technical Sergeant Frank Kowalski prepared to engage the attackers as they passed overhead. The coordination that followed demonstrated the sophistication of American defensive gunnery training. Instead of each gunner engaging the nearest target, the crew executed a predetermined defensive plan that maximized their collective firepower. Walsh engaged the lead fighter with sustained bursts designed to force evasive maneuvers rather than achieve immediate kills. Kowalski tracked the second fighter, timing his fire to coincide with the moment when the German pilot would be committed to his attack run and unable to take evasive action. The defensive barrage began when the German fighters reached a range of 800 yards. Walsh opened fire with his twin 50-caliber guns, sending tracers toward the lead Messerschmitt. The German pilot immediately began evasive maneuvers, but the sustained fire forced him to break off his attack prematurely. Kowalski engaged the second fighter as it passed through his field of fire, scoring multiple hits on the aircraft's port wing and engine cowling. The third and fourth German fighters pressed their attacks despite the defensive fire. O'Brien rotated his ball turret to track the third attacker, opening fire as the Messerschmitt committed to its attack run. His sustained burst caught the German fighter in the engine section, causing immediate white smoke to pour from the cowling. The fighter rolled inverted and began a steep dive, with no parachute observed. O'Brien's first confirmed victory of the engagement. The fourth German fighter managed to complete its attack run, firing a burst of cannon and machine gun fire that struck Defiant Lady's port wing. The projectiles punched multiple holes in the wing structure and damaged the port aileron, reducing the bomber's maneuverability. However, the fighter's successful attack also exposed it to defensive fire from multiple gun positions as it passed through the bomber's defensive envelope. Chen, operating the tail turret, tracked the fourth fighter as it passed beneath the bomber and pulled up to the right. His sustained fire struck the Messerschmitt's fuselage and cockpit area, causing the aircraft to suddenly roll left and enter an uncontrolled spin. The German pilot attempted to recover, but was unable to regain control before the fighters spun into the ground. Chen's first confirmed victory of the engagement, and his third overall. The initial head-on attack had been repulsed with 2 German fighters destroyed, and the other 2 damaged sufficiently to force them to break off their attacks. However, the engagement had also revealed Defiant Lady's position to other German fighters in the area. Morrison could see additional fighters approaching from multiple directions, indicating that the crew would face sustained attacks for the remainder of their flight over German territory. The second wave of attacks came from a different angle. 6 Focke-Wulf, 190 fighters from Jagdgeschwader. 2 approached from the bomber's port quarter, intending to attack in sequence rather than simultaneously. This tactic was designed to prevent the bomber's gunners from concentrating their fire and to maintain sustained pressure on the defensive positions. Staff Sergeant William Torres, operating the port waist gun, demonstrated exceptional skill as the first Focke-Wulf began its attack run. His fire discipline was excellent, firing controlled bursts that converged on the German fighter's engine section. The damaged Focke-Wulf continued its attack, but with reduced effectiveness, eventually exploding under combined fire from multiple gun positions. Torres was credited with the victory. The remaining Focke-Wulfs pressed their attacks with increasing desperation, but Defiant Lady's crew maintained their coordination despite intense pressure. Kowalski engaged multiple fighters from his dorsal turret position, while O'Brien, Torres, and Martinez created devastating defensive barrages that destroyed 2 additional German fighters and damaged several others sufficiently to force them to break off their attacks. The third wave of German attacks came from experienced pilots who had observed the previous engagements and adjusted their tactics accordingly. 4 Messerschmitt, Bf 109, fighters from Jagdgeschwader. 26 approached from multiple directions simultaneously, intending to overwhelm the bomber's defensive coordination through attacks that required engagement across all defensive sectors. This coordinated attack represented the most serious threat Defiant Lady had faced during the engagement. The German pilots were experienced veterans who understood bomber defensive capabilities and had developed tactics specifically designed to neutralize coordinated defensive fire. Their approach required the bomber's gunners to divide their attention across multiple sectors while engaging targets approaching at different speeds and altitudes. Morrison recognized the danger and immediately began evasive maneuvers within the bomber's limited capabilities. Despite the damage to engines and flight controls, he managed to execute a series of slight course changes that disrupted the German pilots' attack timing and forced them to adjust their approaches. These maneuvers provided his gunners with better defensive angles and complicated the Germans' targeting solutions. Walsh, in the nose turret, engaged the fighter approaching from 12 o'clock high while simultaneously calling out positions for the other attackers. His fire forced the lead German fighter to begin evasive maneuvers earlier than intended, reducing the accuracy of its attack. Kowalski tracked a fighter approaching from 2 o'clock high, timing his fire to catch the Messerschmitt as it committed to its attack run. O'Brien faced the most challenging engagement as he tracked a fighter approaching from 4 o'clock low. The ball turret's position allowed engagement of targets across a wide range of angles, but the approaching Messerschmitt was flying an evasive pattern that made accurate fire extremely difficult. O'Brien demonstrated exceptional gunnery skill, leading the target appropriately and firing controlled bursts that forced the German pilot into increasingly desperate evasive maneuvers. the coordinated German attack achieved partial success. One Messerschmitt managed to complete its attack run and scored multiple hits on Defiant Lady's fuselage and port wing. The projectiles punched through the aircraft's aluminum skin and damaged internal systems, causing additional hydraulic fluid loss and reducing the bomber's already compromised performance. However, the successful attack also exposed the German fighter to devastating defensive fire from multiple positions. Chen, Torres, and Martinez all engaged the successful attacker as it passed through their fields of fire. The concentrated defensive barrage was overwhelming, striking the Messerschmitt in the engine, cockpit, and wing sections simultaneously. The fighter exploded violently, showering debris across the surrounding airspace. O'Brien was credited with the primary victory since his defensive fire had forced the German pilot into the path of the other gunners. The remaining 3 German fighters pressed their attacks despite witnessing the destruction of their squadron mate. Kowalski's fire had damaged one Messerschmitt sufficiently to force it to break off its attack, but the other 2 continued their runs with determination, born of desperation. The German pilots recognized that they were facing exceptionally skilled defensive gunners, and that their only chance of success lay in overwhelming the bomber's defensive coordination through sustained pressure. Walsh engaged one of the continuing attackers with sustained fire that scored multiple hits on the fighter's engine and propeller assembly. The Messerschmitt began smoking heavily, but continued its attack, firing a burst that struck Defiant Lady's nose section and damaged the bombardier's position. However, the fighter's commitment to its attack, despite battle damage, proved fatal when O'Brien's defensive fire struck the aircraft's fuel system, causing an immediate explosion that completely destroyed the Messerschmitt. The final German fighter of the coordinated attack managed to score hits on Defiant Lady's starboard wing and number 2 engine, before being driven off by defensive fire from multiple positions. The fighter survived the engagement, but was too heavily damaged to continue offensive operations, and was forced to return to base with significant battle damage. By this point in the engagement, Defiant Lady had been in continuous combat for over 10 minutes, and had sustained significant damage to multiple aircraft systems. The number 2 and 3 engines were operating at reduced power. Hydraulic systems had been compromised, and the aircraft's fuel consumption had increased dramatically due to the need for high power settings during evasive maneuvers. Morrison realized that his bomber's combat effectiveness was declining rapidly, and that the crew needed to reach friendly territory before facing additional attacks. German ground controllers continued vectoring fighters toward the isolated bomber. A formation of 6 Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters from a training unit approached from the bomber's starboard quarter, representing the 4th wave of attacks. These pilots were less experienced but were flying newer aircraft with improved performance and heavier armament. The inexperienced German pilots employed textbook attack procedures but lacked tactical flexibility when their formations were disrupted by defensive fire. Kowalski engaged the lead elements with exceptional accuracy, scoring hits on 2 fighters during their initial approach. The engagement resulted in 2 additional confirmed victories for Defiant Lady's crew, with Torres and Martinez each destroying a German fighter. The remaining fighters broke off their attacks after witnessing the destruction of their squadron mates. However, Morrison's assessment of his bomber's condition was increasingly grim. The number 3 engine had finally failed completely and was windmilling uselessly in the airstream. The number 2 engine was producing reduced power and consuming fuel at an alarming rate. Most critically, the aircraft's hydraulic systems had been so severely damaged that normal flight controls were becoming increasingly difficult to operate. The final wave of German attacks came from a mixed formation of Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf fighters that had been vectored to intercept Defiant Lady as it attempted to reach the relative safety of Allied-controlled airspace. These pilots included several experienced veterans who had observed portions of the previous engagements and had developed specific tactics for attacking the damaged bomber. The German approach was methodical and professional. Instead of attempting overwhelming attacks that had proven costly, the fighters employed patient stalking tactics designed to exploit the bomber's reduced maneuverability and declining defensive capabilities. They maintained positions outside effective defensive range while looking for opportunities to attack vulnerable areas without exposing themselves to concentrated defensive fire. O'Brien reported the approaching fighters and noted their unusual tactics. "They're staying out of range and looking for an opening," he announced over the intercom. "These guys know what they're doing." Then, Morrison acknowledged the report and began preparing his crew for what he recognized would be the most dangerous phase of their running battle with German fighters. The experienced German pilots had correctly assessed that Defiant Lady's crew was becoming fatigued after nearly 15 minutes of continuous combat. Ammunition supplies were running low in several gun positions, and the physical demands of operating defensive weapons while wearing bulky flight gear in unpressurized aircraft at high altitude were beginning to take their toll on the gunners' effectiveness. The German attack began with a single Messerschmitt Bf-109, making a high-speed pass from long range, intended to assess the bomber's remaining defensive capabilities. Walsh engaged the fighter with controlled bursts, but his fire was less accurate than earlier in the engagement, confirming the German pilot's assessment that the defensive crew was becoming less effective due to fatigue and ammunition constraints. Encouraged by this observation, two Focke-Wulf fighters began coordinated attacks from different angles, forcing the bomber's gunners to divide their attention and defensive fire. Kowalski engaged one fighter while O'Brien tracked the other, but both German pilots employed evasive maneuvers that made accurate defensive fire extremely difficult. The fighters scored multiple hits on Defiant Lady's fuselage and wings before breaking off their attacks. The cumulative battle damage finally began affecting the bomber's flight characteristics severely. Morrison found that the aircraft required constant control inputs to maintain level flight, and the damaged engines were providing insufficient power to maintain altitude during evasive maneuvers. The bomber's speed had decreased to approximately 160 miles per hour, making it increasingly vulnerable to fighter attacks. Chen reported that his ammunition supply was nearly exhausted, and that his turret's electrical system had been damaged by fighter fire. Torres announced similar problems with his waist gun position, indicating that Defiant Lady's defensive capabilities were declining rapidly. O'Brien's ball turret remained operational, but the physical demands of continuous combat were affecting his accuracy and reaction time. The final German attack came from 4 Messerschmitt fighters employing coordinated tactics designed to overwhelm the bomber's remaining defensive capabilities. The fighters approached from multiple directions simultaneously, forcing the defensive gunners to engage multiple targets with reduced ammunition supplies. Walsh, Kowalski, and O'Brien engaged the approaching fighters with their remaining ammunition, scoring hits on 2 of the 4 attackers. However, the reduced defensive firepower allowed the German pilots to press their attacks more aggressively. Multiple fighter cannon and machine gun bursts struck Defiant Lady's fuselage, engines, and control surfaces, causing catastrophic damage to critical aircraft systems. Chen scored one final victory as a Messerschmitt passed through his field of fire during its attack run. His last burst of ammunition struck the German fighter's cockpit area, causing the aircraft to crash near the village of Friedrichroda. However, the successful defensive fire came too late to prevent fatal damage to the bomber. Morrison realized that Defiant Lady could no longer maintain controlled flight and ordered his crew to prepare for bailout. The crew's evacuation was executed with the same precision that had characterized their defensive gunnery throughout the engagement. Defiant Lady crashed in a forest approximately 20 miles southwest of Gotha, after remaining in the air for 17 minutes, following its first serious battle damage. Post-war German records confirmed that Defiant Lady's crew had achieved 8 confirmed fighter victories during their running battle over central Germany. The bomber's defensive action had destroyed or damaged fighters from 3 different Jagdgeschwader units and had significantly disrupted German fighter operations in the Gotha area. More importantly, the engagement had demonstrated the lethal effectiveness of properly trained and coordinated bomber defensive crews. The impact on German fighter tactics was immediate and lasting. Luftwaffe pilots quickly learned that attacking damaged American bombers required extreme caution, and that apparent easy targets could prove to be lethal opponents. The psychological effect of losing experienced pilots to defensive fire from crippled bombers forced changes in German attack procedures that reduced the effectiveness of fighter operations against American bomber formations. Intelligence analysis of the engagement revealed the sophisticated nature of American defensive gunnery training and the high level of crew coordination that experienced bomber crews could achieve. German pilots reported that the defensive fire from Defiant Lady had been more accurate and concentrated than typical bomber formations, indicating that individual crew training and experience were critical factors in defensive effectiveness. The crew members who survived the bailout and subsequent capture provided detailed accounts of their defensive engagement that influenced American bomber training programs. Their descriptions of coordinated defensive fire control and ammunition management became standard elements of gunnery training for replacement crews. The techniques they had developed through combat experience were incorporated into formal training curricula. Morrison and 6 of his crew members survived their captivity and returned to the United States after the war. Their post-war interviews provided valuable insights into the psychological and physical demands of sustained defensive combat and the factors that enabled exceptional performance under extreme stress. Their experiences influenced the development of post-war military training programs and crew selection procedures. The encounter over Gotha demonstrated that properly trained and experienced bomber crews could achieve defensive capabilities that exceeded German expectations and tactical planning. The engagement proved that damaged bombers were not automatically easy targets and that American defensive firepower could be lethal even when aircraft systems were compromised by battle damage. For 17 minutes on February 24, 1943, the crew of one damaged B-24 Liberator engaged multiple formations of German fighters in a running battle that challenged every assumption about bomber vulnerability and defensive capability. Their coordinated defensive fire achieved 8 confirmed victories against experienced Luftwaffe pilots, while demonstrating the sophisticated gunnery techniques that American crews had developed through training and combat experience. That's how Luftwaffe pilots were stunned when one damaged B-24 shot down 8 fighters before crashing through defensive coordination that maximized firepower effectiveness, crew training that emphasized mutual support, and combat experience that enabled exceptional performance under extreme pressure. The engagement over Gotha proved that American bomber defensive capability had evolved far beyond German understanding and expectations.